Hello, on behalf of the Biochemical Society and Portland Press, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, which is part of our Biochemistry Focus webinar series. Topics in the series include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. Each webinar will give you the opportunity to ask questions via text, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series. Please see the Biochemical Society website for more details. Hello everyone, my name is Frank Wesley. I work as a postdoc at the UK Dementia Research Institute in Cardiff. It's my pleasure to chair today's webinar about drug repurposing. Drug repurposing aims to find and test novel therapeutic uses for existing drugs that have been approved or investigated. And I would like to use this opportunity to promote our future scientific meeting about this topic organized by the Biochemical Society. The two-day conference will take place in London on the 10th and 11th of May this year. And this is going to be our second meeting on this topic, and it will provide an interdisciplinary discussion and networking platform that welcomes attendees from the academic, industrial, clinical, and regulatory field. Oral communications slots are available at this meeting, and we would like to encourage all attendees, particularly early career researchers, to submit an abstract to be considered for a talk or a poster. And please remember, the abstract deadline is the 10th of March, so in about 2 weeks. Please do check the event website for more details. And the conference will also be live streamed, so you're more than welcome to register to join us remotely. And live stream registration will be available soon. And today's webinar is titled Drug Repurposing: Opportunities to Create Patient Impact Through Translational Research. And I'm delighted to welcome and introduce Dr. Clare Thibodeaux as our invited speaker. She's the Vice President of Scientific Affairs at Cures Within Reach, a US-based nonprofit focused specifically on repurposing research. Clare Thibodeaux holds a PhD in tumor biology from Georgetown University. She works with a variety of stakeholders to catalyze repurposing research opportunities. Clare is responsible for leading new scientific initiatives at Cures Within Reach, managing Cures Within Reach's scientific grant outreach and review process. And on top of that, she's also leading the Science Advisory Board and developing patient education events. This webinar will focus on drug repurposing as a drug development strategy, providing insights on how preclinical repurposing research can lead to clinical repurposing trials and how repurposing research could be funded. Questions will be asked after Claire's presentation, but you can send in your questions already during the talk. If you have a question, please type it in the question box as shown on the image on the screen. And after the talk, we will try to go through as many questions as time allows. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. And with that, I would like to hand over to Clare to start her presentation.
Great, thank you, Frank. And thanks to everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see the slides.
Great, fantastic. Well, thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm very excited to share some examples about drug repurposing and some experience from Cures Within Reach. So before I get started, I do want to have a few definitions so that we're all on the same page. When Cures Within Reach talks about repurposing, we're talking about finding new indications for drugs, devices, nutraceuticals, diagnostics that have already been approved for human use and testing them in different indications than what they've already been approved for. This is a little bit different than repositioning or rescue. These are compounds that are human safe. They've made it partially through testing and the regulatory pathway, and then they've been shelved for one reason or another. And then a researcher comes along, takes it off the shelf, and uses these assets in a different indication. This is related to repurposing, but outside the bounds of Cures Within Reach's specific mission. I'll also be talking about philanthropic of repurposing, which if you imagine taking a generic drug and repurposing that, that might be an opportunity that has high patient impact and value, but low commercial value. And this is in contrast to commercial opportunities where if it's successful and taken up by a company, there might be an opportunity to generate a profit from these repurposing opportunities. So again, Cures Within Reach is a nonprofit based in Chicago in the United States. We have been around focused specifically on repurposing research for almost 15 years now. And we are focused on repurposing because we do believe this is the quickest way to create patient impact. We are disease agnostic, we are geography agnostic, we are institution agnostic, patient population agnostic. What matters to us most is the repurposing. And then what we do is we work with our supporters in a donor-directed impact philanthropy model so that we find and fund projects that are in their specific area of interest. So I hope this slide kind of gives you a general idea of what I mean by that. So we have currently 35 ongoing projects in 28 diseases. Most of these projects are located in the United States, but we do have projects in 6 other countries, including England, and we'll talk about that project later on in the presentation. Most of our projects are clinical. We do have a handful of preclinical projects, but the majority of what we do are clinical trials. And even though we have mostly adult, about 31% of our portfolio is in pediatrics. So I mentioned that we fund clinical trials, but it's not just any clinical trials. There's a specific stage that we really like to fund, and we call this the comeback when funding. So this is when a PI may have a really interesting repurposing research idea supported by strong preclinical data. They may write a grant, let's say, to the National Institutes of Health in the United States. They get the grant back with the feedback that says, you know, this sounds really interesting. Come back when you have proof of concept data. Come back when you know the safety of the drug in this new disease area. Come back when you have the dosing worked out. So these are the type of projects that Cures Within Reach might fund with this proof of concept clinical trial. And we've found that this is a really effective method for these PIs to then leverage the data into additional follow-on funding and bigger trials down the road. So as I mentioned, we've been funding these projects for almost 15 years now. We've invested about $7.5 million so far, and our PIs to date have gone on to raise $75 million in follow-on funding. So it really is a great example of how our funds can be catalytic to help move these projects along. We typically do not fund late stage or basic research. We can sometimes when that's in the specific area of interest of our donors. Even though we don't fund in those areas, we certainly recognize the importance of a strong pipeline of data and evidence in order to get to those proof of concept clinical trials. So, you know, again, why repurposing? It's really the straightest, fastest line to patient impact. But there's also a lot of other advantages. First of all, the repurposing opportunities are really quite unlimited. When you think about there are more than 7,000 unsolved diseases out there and thousands of already approved therapies, you know, that's just a rich area for drug discovery. And it can work in almost any disease. Some of the areas that we see a lot of drug repurposing in are rare disease, oncology, and pediatrics. But that doesn't mean that this strategy couldn't be employed in any specific disease area. And there's been a lot of new tools and technologies that are really helping advance drug repurposing. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, the ability to look through electronic health records and find these drug repurposing candidates has really helped accelerate this research and drive the proof of concept clinical trials. And with that kind of data, it really allows researchers to think about patient impact rather than mechanism of action. They can look for things that have a clinical impact without knowing all the mechanisms behind it. And quite honestly, that is not something that patients really think about. If we think about helping patients, making patient impact, these patients want therapies that work, and they don't necessarily care how they work, but as long as they are improving their quality of life and their disease outcomes. So as you may imagine, repurposing has really come into the spotlight in the public eye a lot more with the COVID-19 pandemic. The general public now has a much better understanding of what many patients with rare diseases or cancer or other life-threatening conditions know, and that is that the speed with which existing drugs can be used to treat an ongoing condition is extremely important. And we have seen some successes with COVID-19 repurposing, especially in those patients who are sickest from dexamethasone, tocilizumab, baricitinib. Those have all been able to help patients who needed it the most. And drug repurposing in COVID-19 continues, not just for acute COVID, but also now for long COVID, which I think we all see is really going to be a growing problem in the coming years. So I think altogether, we've seen that drug repurposing, despite some of the challenges it might have in terms of finding funding and clinical adoption, that it really is an important strategy in the drug development process. It's not going to replace de novo drug development, but it will be complementary to that process. And even though repurposing has come into the spotlight recently, it is certainly not a new idea. This table is taken from a paper that was published over 10 years ago, and already you can see a pretty impressive list of repurposing examples. And there's just 3 that I've highlighted here that have really stood out as true, global success stories. The first is dimethyl fumarate, also known as Tecfidera. Originally started as a psoriasis treatment, is approved for multiple sclerosis, and now it's being used in over almost 70 countries around the world and helping hundreds of thousands of patients. We also have methotrexate, a cancer treatment that has become the most effective treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. And then finally, thalidomide. Thalidomide is a drug that's had a very tragic history. However, when it was used in multiple myeloma, it was able to really become a standard of care. And that is being carried on now. Its next generation derivative, lenalidomide, is still being used by patients with this cancer all over the world. So I do want to talk about how biochemical and preclinical research can add value to repurposing clinical trials, either by creating the evidence on which to base those trials or by adding a commercial opportunity. And so what I'm going to do now is just talk about a few examples in a couple different categories. So the first is repurposing an approved drug in its current formulation. And this is what most of the Cures Within Reach portfolio is. So I do want to start with an example that is one of our earliest success stories and one we're really proud of. This is in a pediatric autoimmune syndrome called autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome. I'll call it ALPS for short because it's really hard to say the whole thing. But as hard as it is for me to say, it's even harder for these kids who have this disease. And you know, they don't have a they don't thrive. They don't have a very good prognosis. It's just a very tough disease. We began working with Dr. David Chichi out of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he had this idea to take the kids who were the sickest that weren't responding to other therapies and treat them with sirolimus, a generic transplant drug. Before he could do that, he first had a mouse model of ALPS and tested this drug in mice. We supported that project. When that was successful, we then went on to support a small clinical trial with patients. Again, it was small. This is a rare disease, so it's not a large patient population. And what he found was just truly amazing. Almost all of the kids went either into complete or total remission after being on sirolimus. And this is a durable remission that has allowed them to go on and live almost normal lives. Shortly after Dr. Chichi published his results, he started getting contacted by other clinicians who had these patients, asking him how he treated the patients, what the dosing was, how that worked. More case studies came into the literature, and we're very excited to say that now sirolimus is an accepted standard of care for these patients. Again, this is also all done off-label. There's never been a label change. Sirolimus is not approved by a regulatory body for this indication. So it's an example of not only how off-label use can make a difference, but this is a great example of that philanthropic type of drug repurposing that I talked about in the beginning. So another example I want to share is one more recently funded by Cures Within Reach. We just started funding this project out of the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas, focusing on pediatric osteosarcoma. And this is adding hydroxychloroquine to chemotherapy regimen. So unlike the previous example that I gave you, which was based on mouse data, this project was based on preclinical results from cell lines. So it's kind of a reminder that animal projects are not always needed when it comes to launching repurposing clinical trials, especially in the proof of concept stage. This was actually an ongoing project when we funded it, and our funding is actually not to support the clinical trial piece of it, but to support a study alongside that to identify biomarkers to help us understand how some patients may respond to treatment and others may not. So again, this is an example where the preclinical piece of it is complementary and supportive of the clinical trial. So there are ways to collaborate with clinical trials in the repurposing space. So the next example I'm going to give is looking at a way to create commercial value with repurposing. And one way to do that is to reformulate a drug for a new method of delivery. The first example comes from the Cures Within Reach Impact Award portfolio. So we do, in addition to funding grants with academic partners and research partners, we do have a program that provides funding to startup companies who are working in the repurposing space, and Surratt is one of those companies in the Cures Within Reach portfolio. This company came out of the University of Chicago, and their goal is to take IGF-1, which is an injectable drug, and reformulate it into an intranasal delivery system in order to treat migraines. So with this new delivery system, they expect the time to treatment to be shorter, and for a rapid onset of action, and to increase the bioavailability of the drug. I want to mention that this is still very early on in its development. It has not yet been moved to clinical trials. It is still in the preclinical trial phase. But again, that reformulation is what has given it its commercial value. And for a more advanced example of reformulation, I will point you to a product that came out from Insight Pharma for the ruxolitinib drug. So this is a drug that was originally an oral drug and approved in its oral form for myelofibrosis, which is a rare type of blood cancer. Insight then was able to get this oral drug approved for 3 additional indications. But in that time, they also wanted to reformulate it into a topical cream, which they did. And this topical would be specifically for different dermatological conditions. Last fall, they received the first approval for atopic dermatitis for their topical cream. And now this cream is being tested in 2 other dermatological conditions in clinical trials right now. So again, this is another example of how a company has been able to take their products and reformulate it in a way that can help many different types of conditions. So finally, I want to talk about combination products. This is another way for both philanthropic and commercial projects to move forward. As promised, I have some more information on the project that we are currently funding at the University of Cambridge. This is a project that's looking at osteosarcoma, combining 2 different generic drugs. One is a beta blocker and one is an anti-inflammatory. And what's different about this project is that it's not in humans, it's not in mice. Instead, it's in canines. So dogs have a natural occurrence of osteosarcoma that does mimic the same clinical pattern in humans. So, one important thing to think about from this particular example is that as you're thinking about your model, your animal model system, you might think about, are there other alternatives rather than just mice? Is there another type of animal system that may be more appropriate? So this project is taking these 2 drugs and giving them to the dogs, who are the patients in this case, to see if together they can reduce inflammation and improve outcomes following surgery. And one of the great advantages of this kind of canine clinical trial is that the evidence that it will generate, because this is a natural pattern of disease, can be much stronger when coming to support a clinical trial in humans. We all know that many times we can be very successful at curing a lot of different diseases in mice, but that doesn't always translate to humans. So using these natural occurrences, these natural models of disease can really help improve success when it comes to the human clinical trial. And then there are examples in industry of when two drugs can be combined into a single medication. And this is a great example, again, of how biochemists can really help add value to repurposing. One example is from Horizon Therapeutics. This is a company that has combined ibuprofen and famotidine into one pill, which was then approved for rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. So this combination is more protective for these patients when it comes to taking high amounts of ibuprofen. And it can also, one of the advantages of combining different medications into a single medication is it can really help improve patient adherence to the medicine. They don't have to worry about taking so many pills. If they can only take one, that's a real advantage. The other example I'd like to share is Vyxeos from Jazz Pharmaceuticals, which is combining two chemotherapy drugs together for acute myeloid leukemia patients. And this is a really interesting example, I think, because biochemistry comes into play here a couple different ways. First of all, the molar ratio of the two drugs together is making them more synergistic and potent when combined together rather than giving them separately. And the drugs are then packaged in this liposome coating, which is more effective when it comes to uptake by cancer cells specifically. So not only is the treatment more potent, but it's slightly more targeted as well, which is a really great advantage to patients. So I do hope these examples have been helpful in giving you some idea of how biochemical work can drive repurposing research. And you know, whether that's at the preclinical stage as you're putting together evidence for clinical trials, or at the clinical stage where there is opportunity to support clinical trials by biomarker work or other types of chemical studies that can help enrich the data that is derived from a clinical trial, or even still in finding ways to create commercial value or increased patient impact by working with these molecules and modifying them in ways that are beneficial. So if you are thinking about pursuing a repurposing research strategy, we found that there's a couple questions that you can ask yourself along the way, which can be very helpful. The first is, might seem kind of obvious, but is really important, is just think about what resources your institution has that can help you. This could be a drug screening program. This might be a program that focuses on translational research, not necessarily repurposing, but repurposing certainly fits within the definition of translational research. They might have, there might be people who can guide you. It's not just resources in terms of core facilities and different types of infrastructure like that, but are there others at your institution who are already focused on repurposing? It's always helpful if you have someone you can talk to, maybe learn some best practices, get some ideas, have that sort of sounding board. You also want to try and figure out where in the pipeline you want to focus. And this is really important, not only when it comes to everything else in terms of seeking funding and collaborators and resources, but also, you know, you want to find out who can take that research to the next step. If you're focused on screening, who's going to put together a mouse model or an animal model? If you are working on animal models, who then can take it to the clinical trial stage and work with these individuals as soon as possible? Not only because, of course, we all want our research to move forward and impact patients, but because you want to make sure that you are designing your research in such a way that will create usable, actionable data that the next person down the line can build on and work from. You might want to ask yourself, are you going to be focused on philanthropic projects, commercial projects, both types of projects? If you are going to be focused on commercial projects and you want to learn more about that, you should really contact your tech transfer office in those endeavors. We call them tech transfer offices in the United States. I don't know if the term translates over to your institutions, but basically these folks are working with researchers who come up with these ideas that do have potential for intellectual property, and they help guide them on how to submit a patent, how to protect their idea, and how to move it forward with interested parties who might be interested in licensing the technology or moving it forward in their own way. And the tech transfer office can be a real wealth of information. And then finally, the big question, of course, is who's going to fund your research? What are those sources? This is a big question in all kinds of research, especially when it comes to repurposing. Again, in the United States, we have at our institutions offices of foundation relations who deal with charities of all kinds and know about all different kinds of funding opportunities out there. So there may be an office like that at your institution. I do know that in the NHS, there has been an increased focus on drug repurposing as a strategy for patient care, and this increase in interest can lead to more infrastructure and support around repurposing research. But it's not just the government who is interested in repurposing research. There are various charities, not just Cures Within Reach, but others that have a focus in translational research or in repurposing specifically. One that I know of in the UK is LifeArc. They are very focused in translational research. In Europe, there's an organization called the Anti-Cancer Fund, which is focused on repurposing in cancer. So if you have a cancer project and you want to know about more of their work, I encourage you to look them up. They're a great organization. And then there are some companies that are very interested in learning how to commercialize repurposing opportunities. There's a company called Helix based in the UK, as a matter of fact, that works with the rare disease space and researchers, patient groups, all the stakeholders in that area to take commercial opportunities in rare disease forward. So there are opportunities for support out there, and I encourage you to look into some of these and learn more. And of course, Cures Within Reach does provide, as I hope you know now, repurposing research grants for clinical trials. And right now we do have some open and soon to be open funding opportunities in specifically our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. So these do have some geographic limitations to them. They are either focused in the United States, looking at repurposing research to address health disparities, or repurposing research in any disease area that are led by minority PIs. We also have another initiative specifically based for underserved PIs who are based in low and lower middle income countries. We call this our Regrow program. And This has been, this year will represent year 3 of this program. This has been a really great initiative to uncover a lot of fantastic repurposing research ideas in countries that don't get a lot of attention. The only difference with this particular funding opportunity is that it must be a generic drug, device, nutraceutical, or indigenous medicine. We are only looking for philanthropic projects for low and lower middle income countries. So while I know that some of you or many of you may not be eligible for these opportunities, we do encourage you to think about collaborators or colleagues who might be, and any connections that you have, we would welcome those connections and talking to these individuals and learning more about their work. And although the funding would go to a US or a LMIC institution, that doesn't mean they can't be working with others anywhere all over the world. So these are, we are having proposal submission deadlines in late spring. I will tell you that Cures Within Reach as an organization, we have a 2-stage submission process, where first we ask for brief proposal submissions. They are reviewed by our external grant review committee. They're reviewed, they're scored, they're ranked, and the top submissions will then be invited to submit a full grant. From there, we then send the full grants again to our external review committee. They go through the same scoring and ranking process, and we make our funding decisions from there. So please know that we do have this 2-step process, and the first stage of that is the proposal submissions, likely due late spring 2022. I do also want to let everybody know that despite these funding opportunities, we are always looking to learn more about new repurposing ideas, new repurposing clinical trials, because we don't have a set schedule for our funding opportunities. They can come up at any time. So when we know about these types of opportunities, they get added to our pipeline of projects, and then we reach out to the PIs when a appropriate funding opportunity becomes available. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time and attention today. I do have my email address up here on the screen. If you want to learn more about Cures Within Reach, our funding, our work, anything, I do encourage you to reach out to me directly. And I'd be happy to answer any questions now and also after the webinar. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Claire. That was a great, nice overview talk about about drug repurposing opportunities, really highlighting some great repurposing examples, showing how important and impactful it can be for patients in critical need for therapy. And also thank you for the pointers towards the end of your talk with regards to potential collaborators and even other funding partners besides Cures Within Reach. So we can now welcome questions for Claire. If you have a question, please type it in the question box as shown in the image here on the screen. And while I wait for the first questions to come in, I just start the Q&A session with some discussion and a few first questions. And one of them would be with regards to timescales. So if I had generated some nice, strong preclinical evidence for repurposing project, and ideally have done some animal work perhaps already in my lab or with collaborators, and the study is published already, and I now want to look whether I can take this forward with, for example, with Cures Within Reach, and I apply and reach out to Cures Within Reach. How long would it take sort of to make a decision about that project, and when could the first proof of concept clinical trial start?
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Frank. So if a PI is responding to an open funding opportunity, It's generally from the deadline for the proposals until we make a decision about who to invite for full grants. That's generally about 8 weeks. Then from when we invite the full grants, PIs have about 4 weeks or so to work on their full grants. After the full grants deadline, it's maybe about another 8 weeks from there to when we make a funding decision. So from the time of the proposal submission deadline to the decisions about funding, that's generally, 6, 7, 8 months, something like that, depending on, different kinds of schedules, but in that sort of range, 6 to 8 months. Once we make a funding decision, we start working with a PI's institution right away on the legal documents. So we hope to get those finalized within a 6-month period. Shorter is always better. I think that's good for everyone, but we all know that certain institutions have, they have different timelines internally when it comes to reviewing legal documents. But as soon as we get the documents signed and ready to go, we will start the clinical trial right away. We will, issue the first payment, and then we're on our way. I will say that we do not require that any kind of IRB or ethics committee approvals are in place before we start funding. This is a question we get a lot. Our researchers can build that into the timeline of the project. So it could be that once we start funding, the first 3, 4, 5 months are spent getting all the regulatory approvals lined up.
I see. Okay, great. Yeah, I've seen the first questions are coming in. Thank you very much. And I just start by the order. Nicholas Tongs asks, is it possible to obtain patent protection for drug repurposing approaches? So that's a difficult one, I suppose.
Well, it depends. It really does depend. And at Cures Within Reach, that's not what we do necessarily, and that's why talking to a tech transfer office or similar at your institution at the beginning of your project is really important. But for some of the examples I showed where drugs were reformulated, that is certainly an area where it's possible to obtain patent protection. When drugs are combined in a unique way, that is also an opportunity where patent protection may be available. When you can show a unique mechanism of action, I know that there's been some cases where people have been able to obtain patent protection in that sense. So there are possibilities. Not everything will fall into that. If you think about the sirolimus example that I showed, that was just taking the drug, using it in the same formulation. Maybe the dose was a little bit different, I don't know, but and then giving it to these kids. There was an opportunity for patent protection there, but it was still being able to be used by patients readily.
Okay. And then another question from Alan Richardson. He's reaching out. Can you help with connecting scientists like me to clinicians in the US or low middle income countries? I've been trying to do a repurposing project in oncology for years and have found UK clinicians to be quite risk adverse.
Yeah, so I would encourage, was it Alan, I think?
Alan, yeah.
Alan, if you want to send me an email and tell me a little bit more about your project, I can see if there's anybody in our network that might be interested in learning more. We do try and make connections when we can. We can't always promise that the connections will work out or what will happen, but if we have people that have common interests, we're always happy to make introductions to help further repurposing.
Great, thanks, Claire. We have another question. Is there any formula to relate the effective drug dosages in cell culture systems and extrapolate to human dosages? Asked by Dr. Deepa.
Well, that is a very good question. And as funders, we don't necessarily get that involved in that type of question. I would say that, there are lots of individuals who are actually working on these types of things. And, I think that's a really great point, is that what we found is that a lot of times researchers are at their institution and they think they're the only one working on repurposing, because it's not something that's really talked about very much. It's not like there's a department of repurposing, like there's a department of oncology or a department of neurology. But from our experience, when researchers kind of ask around a little bit at their institution, they'll find others that'll be like, oh yeah, I work on that too. I just didn't think anybody else was working on it besides me. I thought I was the only one that was interested in that. So I really do encourage reaching out to colleagues and asking them, because they would probably have much better information on those types of specific questions than I can help with. And I think it also then creates a repurposing community at your institution and in your own network that you can rely on and learn from moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Another one. What are the criteria for selecting the projects you are going to fund? It's asked by Chin Chukudi.
Yeah, so we do rank score our proposals on a set of criteria. The level of innovation in the repurposing space. So we're not necessarily talking about innovation in that you're developing something new, but is this a unique use of this repurposed therapy? The research plan, is it sound? Does it make sense? The patient impact, is this a unmet medical need that patients can really benefit from? What's the potential speed to get this therapy into patients if this is a success? And the investigator and the environment, is this the right team for the job? And then finally, the value of Cures Within Reach's funding. And we're not talking about value in a business sense, but more of with our funding, will this project be able to create a bigger impact down the road? So will this likely generate data that can then be leveraged into a larger follow-on study or a larger grant? So those are the main categories that we look at.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we have some feedback from Nicola Whitehill. Hi, great presentation. Thank you. As a patient living with systemic sclerosis, scleroderma, for the last 24 years, this is most encouraging. Do you have any observations about drug repurposing in systemic sclerosis?
I would have to look around a little bit on that, but I do know that when it comes to rare diseases, systemic diseases, repurposing is really, what we found is that it can really help in as one part of a treatment strategy or a drug development strategy. So with systemic diseases, chronic diseases, drug repurposing can certainly supplement and help other existing therapies. It can also help a patient get to another newer therapy that may be coming out down the road. So if you work with patient advocate groups, support groups, they typically have a lot of information on those types of things. There's a great group based in the UK. Used to be Find a Cure. They just changed their name to Beacon. That really help rare disease patients and help find some of these useful therapies for them as well.
Okay, I didn't know Find a Cure has changed its name recently.
Yeah, effective February 1st.
All right, okay, thanks. And a more generic question from Fiona Vera McTiernan. How are most drugs identified for repurposing? Is it through side effects they have in other diseases, or are they identified by thinking about how they work? So this is more of a generic question.
Yeah, that is yes to all of those things and more. So what we found is that sometimes it can be from clinical observation. So a PI might have a patient or a set of patients that are taking a drug for something else. I'll make up an example. So let's say they're taking a heart medication and they say to the doctor, you know, my psoriasis has really been a lot better since I've been taking this heart medication. So that might be a genesis for a repurposing research idea. What we found is that now that artificial intelligence and machine learning tools are becoming more and more available, and that there's more access to electronic health records, that some researchers are sifting through those and finding where is some clinical evidence to support different repurposing ideas. That's one way to find out drug candidates. Drug screenings are another. There's drug libraries that are specifically made up of repurposed drugs, and those can be screened in a particular disease area. There's actually one of those drug libraries, it's called Reframe, out of La Jolla in California, the Scripps Research Institute, that's being used just for that. They can start to identify drug candidates, and actually they've launched a couple clinical trials based on results from screening against approved drugs. So there's lots of different ways. There's also, you know, looking at similar, you know, diseases with similar mechanisms of actions and saying, okay, this drug works in this type of cancer that has a certain pathway. I know that this other type of cancer also involves that same pathway. Perhaps there might be some opportunity to use that drug in that other cancer. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a wide field.
Yeah.
Our last question is from Gamzi Bora. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm wondering about your opinion about repurposing nutraceuticals.
Yeah, and for the purposes of this presentation, I did focus specifically on drugs, but Cures Within Reach, we are open to repurposing nutraceuticals as well as devices and diagnostics. And in fact, we do have a handful of projects that do repurpose nutraceuticals. And we believe that these can be very powerful, you know, bioactive compounds. And the other aspect of that is, while they're not necessarily approved by regulatory agencies, they are generally recognized as safe and widely available for use. So right now we have one project that is looking at repurposing vitamin D in COVID-19. We have another project that's looking at prebiotics to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think those are the only two that we have right now. I might be mistaken, but we have also supported other nutraceutical type projects in the past. And especially when it comes to our low and lower middle income countries projects, we know that nutraceuticals can play a large role, as well as indigenous medicines there.
Okay, sounds interesting. So I would say that brings us to the end of our Q&A session. I would like to finish with a few closing remarks. I would like to thank the audience for attending and stating questions. And I'd like to thank especially Claire for providing this webinar. You can continue the conversation online if you wish so, using the Twitter handles at BiochemSoc and at PP Publishing. In case you or one of your colleagues is interested in our related upcoming conference, Drug Repurposing 2, please remember that the abstract deadline and the early bird registration deadline is the 10th of March. So please do visit the event website for more details and submit your abstract for consideration as an oral communication. We welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in this Biochemistry Focus webinar series. If you have any idea for a webinar in 2022, we invite you to submit a proposal for a future webinar. And if you have missed any of the 40+ webinars that we have run as part of the series or would like to watch them again, please visit our website or visit the YouTube channel. And also the recording from today's webinar will be available to watch within the next couple of weeks. And please join us for the next webinar in the series entitled Plants and Climate Change, the Role of Plants in Achieving Net Zero, which is going to be on Thursday, the 3rd of March at 2 p.m. GMT. And this webinar is a taster for the forthcoming plant collection in the Biochemical Journal that invites reviews, opinion, and original papers related to plant processes and their plasticity and adaptations to climate change, as well as their associated microbial communities that underpin crop and forest resilience to climatic stress. So very interesting topic for the next one. And as a final point, I would like to promote the Biochemical Society as a great organization, bringing together molecular bioscientists from all areas. And the Society offers a variety of fantastic courses, webinars, and conferences. And I'm a member myself, and a membership allows you to benefit from discounted registration fees for society courses and meetings. And it also gives you access to a wide range of grants and bursaries. So please do check our website and get involved. And that's the end. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you especially, Claire, for your fabulous talk and the Q&A session. And we look forward to seeing you again for another webinar in the future. Goodbye for now.